The March wind cut through Jacob Miller's worn coat like a knife through butter as he stood at the edge of the livestock auction in Whitefish, Montana, in the year of our Lord 1873. His calloused hands, scarred from years of hard labor and recent hardship, gripped the last $3 he owned in this world. The coins felt heavy in his palm, weighted with all the decisions he'd have to make about whether to spend them on flour or beans or kerosene for the lamps that barely pushed back the darkness in his empty farmhouse. His stomach hadn't seen a decent meal in 2 days, maybe 3 if he was being honest, and the gnawing hunger had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore, except when he stood up too fast and the world spun around him. Wealthy ranchers bid on prime cattle and strong horses, their voices booming with the kind of confidence that came from full bellies and fuller bank accounts. These were men who owned sprawling operations that stretched across the Montana Territory like empires, men who could afford to bid $50 on a bull without blinking, men who wore clean shirts and new boots and didn't know what it meant to lie awake at night counting pennies and praying for rain or sun or whatever the crops needed that week, men whose wives were still alive. Jacob Miller used to be one of them. Not wealthy, perhaps, but comfortable, respected, a man with a future and a wife who smiled at him over the breakfast table, and plans for children who would run through fields of wheat while cattle grazed on the hillsides. Now he was just another failure in a territory that had no patience for failures. Another man who'd let grief drown him until everything he'd built washed away in the flood. He shouldn't have been at the auction at all. A man with an empty barn and emptier pockets had no business standing in the mud, watching other men buy livestock he couldn't afford to feed, even if someone gave them to him for free. But Tom Bradley had insisted, had practically dragged Jacob into town with promises of free whiskey and the company of men who still remembered when Jacob Miller had been somebody worth knowing. The whiskey hadn't materialized yet, but Jacob had been standing here for an hour, watching horses and cattle change hands for sums of money that made his head swim. He told himself he was leaving. After the next lot, then the next one, and the next, because going back to his empty farm meant facing the silence that Sarah had left behind, and he'd do almost anything to avoid that silence for another hour or two. Now, folks, I know what you're thinking about this next lot. The auctioneer's voice cut through Jacob's thoughts, cracking with barely concealed amusement. But every creature deserves a chance, even the sorry ones, even the ones that make you wonder what the good Lord was thinking when he put them on this earth. Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel and casual. Jacob looked up, squinting against the weak sunlight, to see them leading out a mare that made his weathered heart sink straight down through his chest. She was small, maybe 14 hands at most, which made her barely bigger than a pony by Montana standards, where ranchers preferred horses with size and strength to handle the rough terrain. Her coat was so matted and dull, it was hard to tell what color she'd been born, though underneath all the grime and neglect, he could see hints of something that might once have been chestnut or bay. Her ribs showed through her sides like the keys of a piano, each one clearly defined under skin that seemed stretched too tight over her frame. She limped on her left foreleg, favoring it in a way that suggested pain with every step, and one ear hung at an odd angle, scarred from some old injury that had healed poorly or maybe not at all. But it was her eyes that stopped Jacob's breath in his chest. Dark eyes, almost black, with a depth of suffering in them that he recognized because he saw the same expression every morning when he bothered to look in the mirror while shaving. This was a creature that had given up, a creature that had learned the hard way, that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, that survival meant enduring whatever came next without expectation of kindness or mercy or even basic decency. This was a creature that reminded Jacob of himself. "We'll start the bidding at $10, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the auction yard with practiced ease. "I know she doesn't look like much now, but with a little care, maybe she'd make a decent plow horse for someone willing to put in the work. Or hell, maybe she's good for nothing but dog meat. But that's worth something too, isn't it?" More laughter, harsh and grating. Someone in the back shouted something about glue factories, and the men around him slapped their knees like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all week. The mare stood perfectly still through it all, as if she'd learned long ago that moving only brought pain, that drawing attention only made things worse. Her head hung low, that damaged ear twitching occasionally at the sounds of mockery, but otherwise she might have been made of stone. Something about that stillness, that quiet resignation to whatever fate awaited her, pierced through the numbness that Jacob had wrapped around himself like armor for the past 5 years. He'd taught himself not to feel, not to care, because caring meant hurting, and he'd hurt enough to last 10 lifetimes. But looking at this broken horse, this creature that everyone else had dismissed as worthless, he felt something crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. "Come now, gentlemen," the auctioneer continued when the silence stretched too long. $5. Surely someone needs a... Well, I'm sure she's good for something. Hell, the hide alone must be worth $1 or $2, and there's still some meat on those. Bones, if you don't look too close. More silence, more laughter, the kind of laughter that came easy to men who'd never known what it meant to be dismissed, to be judged worthless, to be worth less than the sum of your parts. The mare lifted her head slightly, just a fraction, and for one brief moment her eyes met Jacob's across the crowded auction yard. In that look, Jacob saw everything he'd been feeling for 5 years, but couldn't put into words. The bone-deep weariness, the sense of being used up and thrown away, the knowledge that you'd once been something more and now you were just this, whatever this was, waiting for someone to decide your fate because you'd lost the will to decide it for yourself. $3. Jacob heard himself say, the words escaping before his mind. Good catch up and ask what the hell he thought he was doing. Every head in the auction yard turned to stare at him. Jacob felt heat crawl up his neck and spread across his face. That familiar burning shame of being noticed, being looked at, being judged by men who probably thought they knew exactly what kind of fool spent his last $3 on a dying horse. But he kept his eyes on the mare, who'd lifted her head a bit higher now, one dark eye fixed on him, with something that might have been hope, if horses could feel such things. If hope was even real, and not just another lie people told themselves to make the darkness more bearable. Well, I'll be damned, and sent to Sunday, the auctioneer muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. $3 going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back, who clearly knows a bargain when he sees one, or else has lost what little sense the good Lord gave him. The laughter that followed Jacob as he made his way through the crowd to claim his purchase burned worse than the cold wind cutting through his threadbare coat. He could hear the whispers, the speculation about whether Jacob Miller had finally cracked completely, whether grief had finally addled his brain beyond all hope of recovery. Tom Bradley caught his arm as he passed, his expression somewhere between concern and pity. "Jacob, what the hell are you doing? That horse won't last the winter. Hell, she might not last the week." "I know," Jacob said quietly, pulling his arm free, "but neither will I if I don't do something different than what I've been doing. And maybe that's worth $3. He paid the auction clerk, watching those 3 precious dollars disappear from his hand, and then he went to claim the mare. Up close, she looked even worse than she had from a distance. Her coat was crusty with old mud, and something that might have been blood. Her mane was tangled into knots that would take hours to work out if he even bothered trying, and the smell coming off her suggested she hadn't been properly cared for in months, maybe longer. "Come on, girl," Jacob murmured, his voice gentler than he'd used with anyone or anything in the 5 years since his wife Sarah had died. "Let's get you home, such as it is." The mare followed him without resistance, her hooves making an uneven rhythm on the frozen ground as she favored that injured leg. It was a 2-mile walk back to his failing farm, and Jacob felt every step of it in his bones. He was 32 years old and felt like 60, worn down by weather and grief, and the constant gnawing fear that he'd lose everything his grandfather had built, everything his father had expanded, everything he'd promised Sarah they'd pass on to their children. children they'd never had, children who'd never run through those fields, or climbed those trees, or learned to ride horses in that empty barn. The Miller farm sat in a valley between two ridges thick with pine, 40 acres of land that had once been the pride of this part of the Montana Territory. His grandfather had settled here in 1845, had fought off harsh winters and harsh men to build something that would last. His father had expanded the operation, adding more land, more cattle, turning a homestead into a proper ranch. And Jacob had married Sarah with promises of making it even bigger, even better, a legacy that would span generations. Now the fences sagged like old men's spines. The barn needed a new roof that Jacob couldn't afford to fix, and the fields lay fallow because he didn't have money for seed, even if he'd had the will to plant them. The farmhouse itself was little more than a cabin, 2 rooms, with a stone chimney that smoked whenever the wind came from the east, which it seemed to do more often than not these days. Jacob led the mare into the barn, which was empty except for an old milk cow named Bessie, who barely gave enough milk to justify her feed. He'd sold his other livestock months ago, trying to keep ahead of the bank that was circling his property like vultures circle a dying animal. Now there was nothing left to sell but the land itself, and he'd sooner put a bullet in his own head than do that. This land was all he had left of his family, all he had left of Sarah, and losing it would mean admitting that he'd failed in every way a man could fail. Not much, I know, he told the mare as he led her to a stall that hadn't housed a horse in over a year. But it's dry, and the roof doesn't leak in this part of the barn, and that's more than what you had before. That's something. He stood there for a moment, one hand on the mare's neck, feeling the tremors that ran through her thin body. She was cold, probably starving, definitely in pain, and he'd just used his last $3 to buy her instead of feeding himself. His neighbors were right to laugh. He was a damn fool. But as he looked into those dark eyes, he saw something flicker there. Something that might have been trust or might have just been exhaustion. Either way, it made him feel something other than numb for the first time in longer than he could remember. He spent the next hour doing what he could for her with what little he had. There was no grain to spare, but he found some hay that wasn't too moldy in the back of the loft and filled her trough. The hay was old, probably not nutritious, but it was something to fill her belly. He drew fresh water from the well, the cold biting at his hands as he worked the pump, and filled her water bucket to the brim. Then, using an old brush he'd kept from Sarah's riding days, a brush that still smelled faintly of the lavender oil Sarah used to rub into the bristles, he began working carefully at the mats in the mare's coat. He moved slowly, talking to her in a low, steady voice, the way he remembered his mother talking to skittish horses when he was a boy, before fever had taken her when Jacob was just 12 years old. "Easy now, girl. Nobody's going to hurt you here, I promise you that. I know you've had it rough. I can see it in your eyes, and I can feel it in the way you flinch every time I move too fast. But you're safe now, you hear me? Whatever came before, whatever they did to you, it's done. It's over. You got a second chance here, and maybe that makes you luckier than most of us, because second chances don't come along too often in this life." The mare stood perfectly still under his ministrations, but Jacob could feel the tension in every line of her body, every muscle coiled tight as a spring ready to release. This was a horse that had learned to expect pain from human hands, that had been beaten or starved or worked beyond the point of endurance. This was a horse that had given up on kindness because kindness had proven itself to be a lie too many times. Jacob understood that feeling better than he cared to admit. As he worked, the reality of what he'd done began to settle over him like a heavy blanket. $3, his last $3 in all the world. The money he should have used for flour or beans or anything practical that would help him survive another week. Instead, he'd bought a broken-down mare who might not live long enough to make his charity worthwhile, all because her eyes reminded him of his own when he bothered to look in the mirror. "Damn fool," he muttered to himself, but he didn't stop brushing. "Damn stupid, sentimental fool." A sound from the barn door made him turn, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt before he recognized the silhouette as female. Standing there, backlit by the fading afternoon light, was a woman he'd never seen before. She was small, barely 5 feet tall if she was an inch, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid that hung down her back. She wore a worn traveling dress that had once been blue, but had faded to something closer to grey, and she carried a carpet bag that looked almost too heavy for her slight frame. She held herself with the rigid posture of someone trying very hard not to appear frightened, but Jacob could see the tremor in her hands where they gripped the handle of her bag. She'd been beautiful once, he thought, and might still be under the dust of travel and the shadows of exhaustion that darkened the skin under her eyes. Mr. Miller, her voice was soft, educated with an accent he couldn't quite place. Eastern, maybe. Boston or Philadelphia or one of those cities where women wore silk dresses and went to fancy parties. That's right. Jacob straightened slowly, suddenly acutely aware of his shabby appearance. The beard he hadn't trimmed in weeks, the dirt under his fingernails, the smell of horse and hay and poverty that clung to him like a second skin. "Can I help you, Mrs. Winters?" Abigail Winters. She lifted her chin slightly, a gesture that might have been pride or defiance, or simply the desperate need to maintain some dignity in an undignified situation. "I'm your mail-order bride, Mr. Miller. I've come from Boston to be your wife." The brush fell from Jacob's hand and clattered on the barn floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. The Mare startled slightly, then settled, watching them both with those knowing eyes. "My what?" "Your mail-order bride. I received your letter 3 months ago, dated December 19th of last year. You said you needed a wife to help run your farm, that you could offer a good home and an honest living to a woman willing to work hard and build a life in the Montana Territory. You sent train fare and said you'd be waiting." She trailed off, looking around the barn with eyes that took in every crack in the walls, every sign of poverty and neglect. Perhaps there's been some mistake. Jacob's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. A letter 3 months ago, December, and then he remembered, the memory surfacing like something dead, rising from deep water. Tom Bradley's birthday, December 19th. They'd gotten drunk together at the saloon. The only time Jacob had let himself fall that far in 5 years of grief. Tom had been going on and on about his cousin out in Wyoming, who'd found a wife through one of those matrimonial agencies back east, how she'd turned his whole life around, how having a woman on the place made all the difference. And Jacob, drunk enough to feel the full weight of his loneliness, had let Tom talk him into writing a letter to one of those agencies. He barely remembered the words he'd scrawled on that paper, something about wanting a wife, needing help with the farm, being an honest man with land and prospects. All lies, of course, or at least exaggerations so extreme they might as well have been lies. But Tom had insisted it was fine, that all men lied a little in those letters, that the women who answered them were desperate enough not to care about the small details. Tom had posted the letter for him the next morning, while Jacob nursed a hangover that felt like divine punishment for his stupidity. Jacob had forgotten about it entirely within a week, convinced that no woman in her right mind would respond to a drunken letter from a failing farmer in Montana. Apparently, he'd been wrong. "Lord, have mercy," Jacob breathed, running a hand through his hair and probably making it stand on end. "Mrs. Winters, I have to tell you, I was drunk when I wrote that letter. Drunk and stupid, and I never in a million years thought anyone would actually respond, let alone travel all the way out. Here, based on what I wrote, if I misled you about my circumstances, I apologize. I'm not usually a man who lies, but I was not in my right mind that night." "I see." Her voice went flat, carefully controlled in that way women had of hiding their true feelings behind a wall of politeness. "Then perhaps you could direct me to the nearest hotel, Mr. Miller, and I'll arrange passage back to Boston in the morning." She bent to pick up her carpet bag, and Jacob saw her hands trembling hard enough to make the bag shake. She was terrified. He realized with a jolt of shame that cut deeper than any knife. She'd traveled God knew how far, probably spending everything she had, based on promises made in a drunken letter from a man she'd never met, and now she was looking at the reality of what she'd done. A failing farm, a barn that was falling apart, a man who'd just spent his last $3 on a worthless horse, and she was trying to maintain her dignity while her whole world collapsed around her ears. He knew that feeling. He'd been living it for 5 years. "Wait," he said, the word coming out rougher than he'd intended. "Mrs. Winters, just wait a minute. Please." She froze, her knuckles white on the handle of her bag, her whole body tensed, like she was ready to run if he so much as moved wrong. Jacob took a careful step forward, then stopped, not wanting to frighten her any more than she already was. He cleared his throat, searching for words that wouldn't make this situation any worse than it already was. "Before you make any decisions, I need to ask you something. How much money do you have left?" Her chin lifted again, pride warring with practicality in her expression. 14 cents. "I have 3 carrots in the root cellar and half a can of beans in the cupboard." He gestured toward the farmhouse, that sad little cabin that was all he had left to offer. "That's not much of a home to offer you, Mrs. Winters, and I won't lie to you about it. I'm barely hanging on here. The bank's circling like vultures, waiting for me to miss one more payment so they can foreclose. I just spent my last cash money on a half-dead horse because I'm apparently a bigger idiot than I thought possible. If you stay, it's going to be hard. Harder than anything you've probably ever done in your life. Harder than working 18 hours a day in a textile mill for wages that barely kept me from starving." Her voice held an edge now, sharp as broken glass. "Harder than living in a boarding house with 12 other women where the landlady watered down the soup until it was barely more than hot water with a few vegetable scraps floating in it, and charged us extra for blankets in the winter, even though the cold came through the walls like we were sleeping outside. Harder than knowing I was one missed day of work, away from being thrown into the street because I had no family, no prospects, and no future worth speaking of." They stared at each other across the barn, 2 people at the end of their ropes, trying to decide if grabbing onto each other would save them or just drag them both down faster. The mare nickered softly behind them, as if offering commentary on the situation, and Jacob felt a wild urge to laugh at the absurdity of it all. "I can work, Mr. Miller," Abigail said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I can cook, clean, sew, tend a garden. I grew up on a farm in Vermont before my father lost everything and moved us to the city looking for work that never materialized. I'm not afraid of hard work. I'm not afraid of dirt or cold or long hours. What I'm afraid of is having no work at all, no purpose, no place in this world where I belong." Jacob looked at her for a long moment, this small, determined woman with fire in her eyes, despite her obvious fear. Then he looked at the mare, still standing quietly in her stall, watching them both with those dark, knowing eyes that seemed to understand more than any horse should. 2 broken creatures he'd taken responsibility for in the span of one afternoon. Maybe he really had lost his mind. Or maybe this was what hope looked like when you'd forgotten what it felt like. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this properly, Mrs. Winters. I'll sleep in the barn until we figure out if this arrangement is going to work between us. You take the house. Tomorrow morning, we'll sit down and talk about expectations, about what we each need from this situation. And if either one of us decides it's not right, that it's not going to work, I'll figure out a way to get you back east. I'll sell something, borrow money, do whatever I have to do. I won't leave you stranded here. That's my promise to you." Something that might have been relief flickered across her face. "That's fair. The house isn't much," he warned her, already moving toward the barn door. 2 rooms, a stone chimney that smokes when the wind comes wrong, and furnishings that have seen better days. But there's a good stove that keeps heat well enough, and the roof doesn't leak too badly, except in one corner of the bedroom where I've got a bucket to catch the drips. Let me get you settled in, and then I'll see about making us some supper with what we've got." As they walked toward the farmhouse, their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground, the mare nickered softly behind them. Jacob glanced back to see her watching them go, her head lifted slightly higher than it had been at the auction, those dark eyes following their progress with something that might have been interest. "What's her name?" Abigail asked, following his gaze. "Don't rightly know. Haven't named her yet. Haven't even decided if she'll live long enough to deserve a name. She's very thin." "Yeah." Jacob felt that familiar twist of foolishness in his gut. "Probably won't make it through till spring, truth be told." "I wouldn't be so sure about that, Mr. Miller." Abigail's voice held something he couldn't quite identify, something that sounded almost like hope. Sometimes all a creature needs is someone willing to give them a chance, someone willing to see past what they are to what they could be. Their eyes met, and Jacob felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening that he thought was locked and barred forever. This woman understood. She understood being at the end, being the one nobody wanted, being worth $3 or 14 cents or nothing at all. She understood what it meant to be thrown away. "I'm glad you came, Mrs. Winters," he said quietly. "Even if I was too drunk to remember inviting you, even if I can't offer you much of anything, I'm glad you're here." A small smile touched her lips, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. "Call me Abigail, only if you call me Jacob." "All right, Jacob." She tested his name on her tongue, and he found he liked the sound of it, liked hearing someone speak his name with something other than pity or contempt. "Now, you mentioned 3 carrots and half a can of beans. Let's see what we can make with that." What they made was a thin soup that barely filled their bowls, more water than substance. But Abigail did something with the last of his salt and some wild herbs she found growing near the well that made it taste better than anything Jacob had eaten in months. They sat at his small wooden table, not quite looking at each other, the reality of their situation settling around them like dust after a windstorm. "Tell me about the farm," Abigail said finally, breaking the awkward silence. "What it was like before things went bad." So Jacob told her. He told her about his grandfather, Daniel Miller, settling this land back in 1845, one of the first homesteaders in this part of the Montana Territory. He told her about fighting off harsh winters and hostile natives, about building the cabin that would become the core of the farmhouse, about proving up on the claim and expanding it gradually until he had 40 acres of good valley land. He told her about his father Thomas taking over the operation, about expanding into cattle ranching, about building the barn and the outbuildings, about making the Miller name mean something in Whitefish and the surrounding territory. He told her about growing up here, about learning to ride before he could walk, about knowing every tree and stream and ridge like he knew his own face. And then, because she sat there listening with eyes that held no judgment, he told her about Sarah. "Met her at a barn dance when I was 23, he said, staring into his empty bowl like he might find answers there. "She was visiting relatives in Whitefish, come out from Ohio to see the frontier. Prettiest thing I'd ever laid eyes on, with blonde hair and blue eyes and a laugh that sounded like music. Took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to ask her father if I could court her proper. What did he say? He said I was a Montana dirt farmer with more land than sense, and his daughter deserved better than a life of hard work and harder winters. But Sarah, she said she didn't care about any of that. Said she wanted adventure, wanted to build something of her own, instead of being some Ohio merchant's wife, attending tea parties and doing needlework. So we got married despite her father's objections, and she moved out here with me. She was happy here." Jacob considered the question, remembering Sarah's face as she'd stood in the doorway of the farmhouse on their wedding day, looking out at the valley with eyes full of dreams. Yeah, I think she was. She had plans, you see, big plans. Wanted to raise cattle and children, wanted to fill this house with noise and laughter, said we'd build the Miller farm into something the whole territory would know about. What happened to her? Abigail's voice was gentle, but Jacob heard the real question underneath. "Why are you alone? Why is this farm falling apart?" "Horse accident." The words came out flat, emotionless, because that was the only way he could say them without breaking. 5 years ago, this coming June, she was riding out to check on the cattle, and her horse spooked at something, a snake maybe, and threw her, broke her neck. She was gone before I even found her body. "I'm so sorry, Jacob." "Me too." He stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something other than sit there drowning in memories. "I should have been with her that day, but I was busy with the planting, and she said she'd be fine on her own. She'd ridden since she was a child. She knew horses, she knew the land. I thought she'd be safe. I thought—" He trailed off, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. Abigail stood as well, moving around the table to stand beside him. She was so small that the top of her head barely reached his shoulder, and when she put her hand on his arm, her touch was feather-light. "It wasn't your fault," she said quietly. "Wasn't it? I should have been there. Should have been riding with her. Should have done 1,000 things differently. And if you had, maybe you'd be the one in the ground, and Sarah would be here instead, drowning in the same guilt you're carrying. Or maybe you'd both be dead. Or maybe nothing would have changed at all. You can't know, Jacob. All you can do is keep living, keep trying, keep moving forward even when it feels impossible. He looked down at her, this stranger who'd appeared in his barn with 14 cents and more wisdom than he'd expected from someone so young. How old are you, Abigail? 26. You? 32, though I feel about twice that most days. I know the feeling. She squeezed his arm gently, then let go, stepping back to give him space. Now, why don't you show me where things are in this kitchen, and tomorrow we'll start figuring out how to turn this situation around. Jacob showed her where he kept his meager supplies, the few dishes and pots he owned, the root cellar where he stored what little produce he had left from last year's garden. She nodded, taking mental inventory, and he could practically see her mind working, planning, figuring out how to stretch nothing into something. That night, after Abigail had retired to the bedroom and he'd made his way back to the barn with a couple of old horse blankets and a pillow that had seen better days, Jacob lay in the hay and stared at the rafters overhead. The mare moved in her stall, and he could hear Bessie the cow chewing cud in the darkness. He'd spent the last $3 he had on a dying horse. He'd acquired a mail-order bride he'd drunkenly summoned and then forgotten about. His farm was still failing, the bank was still circling, and he had no clear idea how to fix any of it. But as he closed his eyes and listened to the familiar sounds of the barn settling around him, Jacob Miller felt something he hadn't felt in 5 long years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't quite so alone anymore, and if that wasn't hope, it was close enough to fool him in the darkness. The next morning, Jacob woke to the smell of coffee drifting into the barn. Real coffee, strong and hot and absolutely impossible, given that he knew for a fact he didn't have any coffee in the house. He sat up in his makeshift bed, hay sticking to his clothes and hair, confused and disoriented for a moment before the previous day's events came flooding back. Abigail, the mail-order bride, the woman with 14 cents who'd traveled across half the country based on the drunken promises of a man she'd never met. He climbed stiffly to his feet, joints protesting the cold and the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, and made his way out of the barn. Morning frost crunched under his boots, and his breath misted in the early light. The sun was just cresting the eastern ridge, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that Sarah used to say looked like God was showing off. When he entered the farmhouse, he found Abigail already dressed and working at the stove. Her hair was still pulled back in that simple braid, and she wore the same worn dress from yesterday, but somehow she'd managed to make the kitchen look more welcoming than it had in years. She'd cleaned, he realized. The floor had been swept, the dishes washed and put away, his one good pot steaming on the stove, and even the windows looked clearer than they had before. "How did you afford coffee?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than intended from sleep. She glanced over her shoulder, a faint blush coloring her cheeks in a way that made her look younger, less guarded. "I had a small bag in my trunk. I've been saving it for something special, for, well, I suppose for today, for a new beginning, if that's what this is going to be." Jacob felt something catch in his throat, tightness that made it hard to swallow. She'd used her precious coffee, something she'd been hoarding probably since she left Boston, to mark this moment, to make this ramshackle farm and its failing farmer feel like they were worth celebrating. He cleared his throat roughly, not trusting himself to speak. "Sit," she commanded, and there was enough authority in her voice that he obeyed without thinking, settling into his usual chair at the table. She poured him coffee in his chipped mug, and when she set it in front of him, their fingers brushed. The contact sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the heat of the cup. "We need to talk about the farm," Abigail said, settling into the chair across from him with her own cup of coffee. "About what we're going to do to save it." Over coffee that tasted like heaven, strong and black and perfect, Abigail laid out what she'd observed in her short time at the Miller farm. She'd been up since before dawn, she told him, walking the property in the early light, taking stock of what they had and what they didn't. "The barn needs work," she said, ticking items off on her fingers, "but the structure is fundamentally sound. The roof leaks, but the beams are solid. The fields are fallow, but the soil looks good, dark and rich. The kind of soil that would grow just about anything if we could afford seed. The chicken coop is empty and falling down, but it could be repaired. The fences need mending, but the posts are still good. That's a generous assessment, Jacob said. Most people would look at this place and see nothing but ruin. Most people aren't looking with the right eyes. She leaned forward, and Jacob found himself drawn to the intensity in her gaze, to the way her eyes lit up with an enthusiasm he hadn't seen in anyone in years. Jacob, you have 40 acres of good land in a valley that's protected from the worst of the winter winds. You have water from that well, and from the creek that runs through the lower 40. You have buildings that need work, but aren't beyond saving. And most importantly, she paused, biting her lower lip in a way that made Jacob forget to breathe. You have that mare. The mare? Abigail, I told you she's half dead. I spent $3 I couldn't afford on a horse that probably won't see summer. Then why did you buy her? The question stopped Jacob cold. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, searching for words that would make sense of what he'd done. I don't know, he admitted finally. I looked at her standing there, and everyone was laughing, and I saw... He trailed off, embarrassed. You saw yourself, Abigail said softly. You saw a creature that everyone else had given up on, and you couldn't walk away. You couldn't let her die without at least trying to save her. That's not practical. That's not good business. No, it's better than that. It's human. It's kind. And Jacob... She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers, her touch warm and... Sure, that mare isn't half as dead as you think she is. What do you mean? I mean, I watched her this morning, really watched her. And I know horses. I grew up with them, learned about bloodlines, and confirmation from my father before he lost his farm. That mare you bought for $3. Abigail's eyes were bright with an intensity that made Jacob's pulse quicken. She's a Morgan horse, Jacob, a purebred Morgan, unless I miss my guess. A Morgan? Jacob shook his head, confused. But Morgans are valuable horses. They're sought after. Why would someone sell a Morgan at a livestock auction for pennies? Because she was in such bad shape that no one could see what she really was. They saw ribs and scars and a limp, and they assumed she was worthless. But look past that. Look at her bone structure, her head, the way she moves even with that injury. She's Morgan, I'm certain of it. And do you know what that means? Jacob shook his head mutely. It means that mare could be worth $100 or more to the right buyer once she's healthy. Morgan horses are prized for their intelligence, their versatility, their strength. They make excellent riding horses, carriage horses, and most importantly, she paused, squeezing his hand, they're exceptional breeding stock. If we could get her healthy, if we could find a good stallion to breed her to, her foals would command premium prices. We could build a whole breeding operation around her. Hope flared in Jacob's chest, sharp and almost painful, like blood returning to a limb that had gone numb. You really think so? You think she's valuable? I know horses, Jacob. My father was a breeder in Vermont before gambling debts destroyed him. I grew up learning bloodlines, learning conformation, learning how to see potential in animals that others overlook. And I'm telling you that mare has the potential to save this farm. But only if we can get her healthy first. How? I don't have money for grain, for veterinary care, for anything she needs. We start with what we have. Fresh water, which we've got from the well. Hay, which you've got stored in the barn, even if it's not the best quality. Time and patience to work with her slowly, to build her strength back up gradually. And then... She bit her lip again, clearly thinking. Then we need to find out who she really is, where she came from. Morgan horses don't just appear at backwater livestock auctions. Someone owned her before, someone who valued her enough to keep her bloodlines pure. If we can trace her back, find her papers, prove her lineage, she becomes exponentially more valuable. That sounds like a lot of ifs and maybes, Abigail. So does staying here and hoping the bank doesn't foreclose. So does planting crops we can't afford seed for. So does every plan when you're starting from nothing. She stood, moving around the table to stand beside him, and Jacob was struck again by how small she was, how delicate, and yet how much strength seemed to radiate from her despite her size. Let me work with her, Jacob. Give me 2 weeks, just 2 weeks, to get her healthy enough to see what she can really do. If I'm wrong about her, if she's just a worn-out nag with no value, then we've lost nothing but a little time and hay. But if I'm right, if you're right, we might have a chance. Jacob finished quietly. Exactly. He studied her for a long moment, this woman who'd appeared in his life like some kind of miracle he didn't deserve. She stood there with confidence and determination written in every line of her small frame, and he made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "All right," he said, "but you'll need help. That mare's been badly treated, and gaining her trust won't be easy. I should warn you, I'm not much of a hand with horses anymore. Haven't ridden in 5 years, haven't worked with them beyond basic care. Then it's good I have experience enough for both of us." She smiled, and Jacob felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. "And it's good I have a partner who understands what it means to need a second chance." The word partner settled into the space between them, carrying weight and promise and possibilities neither of them wanted to examine too closely. Not yet. Not when everything was still so uncertain. "Partners," Jacob repeated, testing the word. He stood, extending his hand. "Partners in saving a farm and a broken horse." Abigail took his hand, her grip surprisingly firm for someone so small. "Partners in saving each other too, I think." And as their hands clasped across his worn kitchen table, with morning light streaming through the recently cleaned windows and the smell of real coffee still hanging in the air, Jacob Miller allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his $3 horse and his 14-cent bride might be the best investments he'd ever made. Over the next 2 weeks, Jacob watched Abigail work magic that he would have called impossible if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. She approached the mare with a patience and gentleness that spoke of years of experience, moving slowly and deliberately, never pushing, never demanding more than the horse was ready to give. She started by just sitting in the stall, talking to the mare in a low, steady voice, letting the horse get used to her presence without any expectation of interaction. Hours she spent like that, while Jacob worked on mending fences and clearing brush from the fields. And when he'd check on her, she'd still be there, sometimes reading aloud from an old book she'd brought from Boston, sometimes just talking about her life, her dreams, her fears. "I think she likes the sound of your voice," Jacob commented one evening, leaning against the stall door to watch them. "All creatures respond to kindness," Abigail said, her hand resting gently on the mare's neck. "They just need time to believe it's real." Gradually, the mare began to trust. She'd tolerate being brushed without flinching, would eat from Abigail's hand, would follow her around the paddock Abigail had cleared and reinforced using materials salvaged from the falling-down chicken coop. And, as the trust grew, the mare's condition began to improve. The matted coat, brushed patiently day after day, began to reveal a deep chestnut color that shone like copper in the sunlight. The ribs, though still visible, became less prominent as regular feeding put weight back on the mare's frame. The limp, treated with cold compresses and gentle exercise, and the removal of a deeply embedded stone that had been causing infection, gradually faded until it was barely noticeable. But the most dramatic change was in the mare's spirit. Where there had been resignation and defeat, life began to return. Her head came up when people approached instead of hanging low in anticipation of punishment. Her eyes brightened, showing intelligence and curiosity instead of dull acceptance. She began to move with a grace that hinted at the quality bloodlines Abigail had suspected. "She's beautiful," Jacob said one morning, watching the mare trot around the paddock with an evenness of gait that would have seemed impossible 2 weeks ago. "I almost can't believe she's the same horse." "She was always beautiful," Abigail corrected, smiling as she watched the mare. "She was just hidden under layers of neglect and abuse. All we did was give her the chance to show her true self." She turned to look at him, and Jacob felt his breath catch at the expression on her face. In the 2 weeks she'd been at the farm, Abigail had transformed more than just the mare. She'd cleaned and organized the house, started a garden using seeds she'd brought from Boston, mended his clothes, cooked meals that somehow tasted like proper food, despite their limited supplies. She'd brought life back to the Miller farm in ways he hadn't thought possible. More than that, she'd brought life back to Jacob himself. He found himself waking earlier, working with more purpose, looking forward to meals and conversations, and the simple pleasure of having another person to share the day with. He found himself noticing things again, the color of the sky at sunset, the way frost patterns formed on the windows, the sound of Abigail's laugh when the mare did something particularly clever. He found himself falling in love with his mail-order bride, this woman who'd shown up with 14 cents and changed everything. "Jacob," Abigail said, breaking into his thoughts, "I need to tell you something about the mare and about what I think we should do next." They walked to the paddock fence, standing close enough that their shoulders almost touched, watching the mare graze peacefully. The sun was warm on Jacob's face, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt something approaching contentment. "I've been studying her markings," Abigail said, "and I'm more convinced than ever that she's a registered Morgan. See that white star on her forehead? And the way it connects to the snip on her nose, that's a very distinctive marking pattern. If we could find her breeding records, if we could prove her lineage, she'd be worth significantly more than I initially estimated. How would we do that? There's a Morgan horse registry in Vermont. We could write to them, describe her markings, see if they have any record of a mare fitting her description that's been reported missing or stolen. It's a long shot, but," she turned to face him fully, "Jacob, I think someone stole her. I think she was a valuable horse that was taken from her rightful owner and run into the ground by people who either didn't know her value or didn't care. And if we can find out who she belonged to, we might be able to claim a reward or at least establish her provenance, which would make her worth even more as breeding stock. That's assuming her original owners want her back. Given her condition when you bought her, I doubt they'd demand her return. More likely they'd be grateful to know she's being properly cared for and willing to provide her papers for a nominal fee. But even if that doesn't pan out," she took a deep breath as if steeling herself, "there's a horse breeder in Helena named Richard Thornton. I've heard of him even back east. He specializes in Morgan horses, and he's known for paying top dollar for quality breeding stock. If we could get her to Helena, let him see her now that she's healthy and moving well, I think he'd make us an offer that could solve a lot of our problems." Jacob felt hope and fear wage war in his chest. Helena's 3 days hard riding from here, maybe 4 if we're leading a horse. And we'd need money for supplies for the journey, money we don't have. "We have some," Abigail said quietly. "I've been setting aside the few pennies we've saved from the eggs Bessie's been laying. And I have a little jewelry I brought from Boston that we could pawn if necessary. It's not much, but it might be enough for basic supplies. And if we get all the way to Helena and this Thornton doesn't want her or offers less than what we need, then we ride home and try something else." "But Jacob," she took his face in her small hands, forcing him to look at her. "We can't stay here doing nothing and expect things to magically improve. The bank is going to come calling eventually. We need to take action. We need to take risks, or we're going to lose everything anyway." He stared down at her, at this woman who'd risked everything on a drunken letter from a stranger, who'd traveled across the country with 14 cents and more courage than 10 men put together. She was right. He knew. Doing nothing was just another form of giving up, and he'd given up on enough things in his life. "All right," he said hoarsely. "We'll try. But Abigail, if this doesn't work, if we fail, then we fail together," she said simply. "That's what partners do." He pulled her close then, unable to resist the urge any longer, wrapping his arms around her small frame. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her hands pressed against his chest over his heart. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 broken people holding each other together, while the mare watched with knowing eyes. That evening, over a simple supper of cornbread and the last of their beans, they made their plans. They would leave in 2 days, giving them time to prepare supplies and make arrangements for Bessie. Tom Bradley had agreed to come check on the cow and the property while they were gone, partly out of friendship and partly, Jacob suspected, out of guilt for being the one who'd convinced Jacob to write that matrimonial letter in the first place. "We'll need to be careful with our supplies," Abigail said, making notes on a piece of precious paper. "Water won't be a problem with the creeks and springs along the route, but food is critical. I can make hardtack and jerky from what we have, enough to last us there and back if we're careful. We'll need feed for the mare too. She's stronger, but still building her stamina back. I've been mixing her hay with some of the wild grasses from the lower field. It's not ideal, but it's better than nothing. We'll supplement with whatever grazing we can find along the way." They worked through the details until full dark, and when Abigail finally stood to retire to the bedroom, Jacob caught her hand. "Abigail, I want you to know I'm grateful for everything you've done here, for believing in this plan when I had no faith left in anything. You didn't have to stay, didn't have to try so hard to make this work, but you did. And he trailed off, struggling to find words for feelings he barely understood himself. You don't have to thank me, Jacob, she said softly. I'm fighting for my future as much as yours, for our future, if that's what this becomes. Is that what you want? A future here with me? She was quiet for a moment, her hand warm in his. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I came here expecting a business arrangement, a practical partnership where I'd work and you'd provide shelter and security. But Jacob, these past 2 weeks, watching you with the Mare, watching you work yourself to exhaustion, to fix fences and clear fields, listening to you talk about your family and your dreams and your grief. I've seen a good man, a kind man, a man worth building a future with, if he'll have me. Abigail. Her name came out rough, choked with emotion. I'm not asking for promises, she said quickly. I know you're still grieving Sarah, still carrying that loss. I'm not trying to replace her or compete with a memory. I want you to know that when I'm with you, I feel safe. I feel seen. I feel like maybe, just maybe, I could be happy here. Jacob stood, pulling her to her feet, and suddenly they were face to face in the dim lamplight, close enough that he could count the freckles dusting her nose, could see the way her breath quickened, could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. I don't want you to replace Sarah, he said quietly. She was part of my life, part of who I am. And I'll always carry that love with me. But Abigail, these past 2 weeks, you've shown me that my life isn't over, that I can feel something other than grief and guilt and exhaustion. You've given me hope when I'd forgotten what hope felt like, and that's worth more than all the horses and land in Montana. He cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. I'm falling in love with you, Abigail Winters. Maybe I started falling the moment you walked into my barn with your 14 cents and your pride and your refusal to give up. And if you'll have me, truly have me, I swear I'll spend every day trying to be the man. You see, when you look at me, instead of the failure I've been for the past 5 years. You were never a failure, Jacob Miller, she whispered, her own hands coming up to cover his. You were grieving. You were lost, but you're finding your way back. And I'd be honored to walk that path with you. He kissed her then, unable to hold back another second. His lips found hers in the lamplight, tentative at first, then deepening as she gasped against his mouth and melted into him. She tasted like hope and home, and everything good he'd thought was lost to him forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply, the words feeling both terrifying and right. I don't know what's going to happen in Helena. I don't know if we can save this farm, but I know that whatever happens, I want you by my side. I love you too, Jacob, she breathed. And I'm not going anywhere. They held each other through the long evening, wrapped in the warmth of new love and fragile hope. And when Abigail finally retired to the bedroom, Jacob found himself thinking that maybe sleeping in the barn wasn't necessary anymore. Maybe it was time to make this marriage real in every sense of the word. But they had a journey ahead of them first, a risky gamble that could make or break their future. There would be time enough for everything else once they returned, once they knew whether the farm was truly saved or whether they'd be starting over somewhere else entirely. For now, hope was enough. Hope and love and a mail order. A bride who turned out to be worth infinitely more than the 14 cents she'd arrived with. The journey to Helena began on a clear spring morning, the kind of day that made a man believe anything was possible. They set out just after dawn, leading the Mare between them, their meager supplies packed in saddlebags that had once belonged to Sarah but now served a new purpose. The weather held. Fair for the first day, and they made good progress along the rutted trail that wound through the foothills. The Mare walked steadily between them, her head up, her ears pricked forward with interest rather than fear. Abigail had named her Penny, she told Jacob, because she'd been worth every penny of those $3 and more. They talked as they traveled, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their failures and hopes. Jacob found himself telling Abigail things he'd never told anyone, not even Sarah, about his mother's death from fever when he was 12, about the weight of inheriting family expectations, about his fear that he'd never measure up to his grandfather's legacy, about the crushing guilt he carried over Sarah's death, the persistent feeling that if he'd just been there, if he'd done something differently, she'd still be alive. "You can't live in the land of if only," Abigail said gently as they walked. "I know because I've tried. If only my father hadn't gambled. If only my mother hadn't died in childbirth. If only I'd been prettier or smarter or better able to find a decent husband back east. I could spend my whole life drowning in if only, or I could accept that the past is done and focus on building a future worth having. You think it's that simple? I think it has to be, or we'll never move forward." That night they made camp in a small clearing near a creek that bubbled over smooth stones. Jacob built a fire while Abigail settled Penny with water and grazing, and they ate the hard tack and jerky she'd prepared, washing it down with cold creek water that tasted of minerals and snow melt. "Tell me about Richard Thornton," Jacob said as they sat by the fire. "How do you know he'll even see us, let alone make an offer?" "Thornton is known throughout the horse breeding community. My father dealt with him before, through correspondence anyway. He's fair but shrewd, and he has an eye for quality that's legendary. If he sees what I see in Penny, he'll make us an offer. The question is whether it'll be enough. How much do we need?" Abigail was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "The bank wants $240 to clear your debt, right?" "Right. Then we need at least that much to save the farm outright. But ideally," she looked up, meeting his eyes across the flames, "ideally, we need enough to pay the bank and have some left over for seed, for supplies, for building up a breeding operation, if we're going to make this work long-term. That's a lot to ask from one horse." "It is. But Jacob, a proven Morgan mare with good bloodlines can fetch $150 or more from the right buyer. Add in potential breeding rights, future foals, and we might be looking at enough to give us a real fresh start." Jacob shook his head, hardly daring to believe it. "A week ago, I had $3 and a death wish. Now I'm sitting here talking about breeding operations and fresh starts with a woman I barely know but somehow can't imagine living without." "Life's funny that way," Abigail said, smiling. "Changes when you least expect it, if you're brave enough to let it." The temperature dropped as night deepened, frost forming on the grass at the edges of their firelight. Abigail shivered despite the flames, pulling her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. Jacob watched her, trying not to show her discomfort, saw the way her teeth wanted to chatter, despite her best efforts to stay still. "Come here," he said, opening his coat. "Jacob, I'm fine, I don't need—" "You're freezing, and we both know it. We only have 2 blankets between us, and they're barely enough for one person. Come here and let me keep you warm. It's practical, nothing more." But as she settled against him, her back pressed to his chest, his arms wrapped around her to share his body heat and shelter her from the wind, it felt like everything. It felt like more than practical when she sighed and relaxed against him, when her shivers gradually subsided and she grew warm and soft in his embrace. "Jacob," her voice was drowsy, peaceful. "Yeah? Thank you for trusting me with this plan, for trusting me with your farm and your future. I know I'm asking you to gamble everything on my judgment of a horse, and that takes courage." He tightened his arms around her, pressing his face against her hair and breathing in the scent of lavender that clung to her despite days without a proper bath. "You're asking me to have faith, and that's something I forgot how to do, but you make me want to try again." She turned in his arms, and suddenly they were face to face in the firelight, close enough to share breath, to feel each other's heartbeat. Her hand came up to touch his bearded jaw, her fingers tracing the line of his face with a tenderness that made his chest ache. "I want to tell you something," she whispered, "and I need you to hear it before we get to Helena, before we know how this gamble turns out. I came here as a mail-order bride, out of desperation and practicality. But Jacob, I'm staying because somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I fell in love with you. Not with your farm or your prospects or what you could offer me. With you, the man who spent his last $3 on a broken horse because he couldn't bear to see her suffer. The man who grieves deeply but loves deeper. The man who makes me feel safe and seen and valued in ways I never have before." "Abigail." His voice cracked on her name. "Let me finish." Her thumb brushed across his lower lip, and he had to fight not to capture it with his mouth. I know we're not properly married yet. We've been careful, kept our distance, maintained propriety, but Jacob, I don't want careful anymore. I don't want to wait for perfect circumstances that might never come. I want—" He kissed her, couldn't help it, couldn't hold back another second. His lips found hers, and she made a small sound of surprise that quickly turned into a sigh of pleasure. She tasted like wood smoke and hope and coming home, and Jacob kissed her like a drowning man finding air, like a man in the desert finding water, like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly alive, finally remembering. When they finally broke apart, both gasping, Jacob cupped her face in his hands and said the words that had been building in his heart for 2 weeks. "I love you, Abigail Winters. I think I started falling the moment you walked into my barn with your 14 cents. And your fierce pride, and your refusal to accept that broken things can't be fixed. You've given me back my life, my hope, my ability to imagine a future worth fighting for. And if you'll have me, truly have me as your husband in every way, I swear I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret taking a chance on a failing farmer in Montana. I could never regret you, Jacob Miller." She kissed him again, soft and sweet and full of promise. Never. They lay together that night under the stars, wrapped in their blankets and each other, and though they didn't cross the final line that would make them husband and wife in the fullest sense, they held each other with the kind of intimate tenderness that spoke of deeper commitment than any physical union. They whispered confessions and promises and dreams in the darkness, and when dawn broke over the mountains, Jacob woke feeling like a new man, a man with something worth fighting for, someone worth fighting for. The second day brought harder travel, as the trail climbed into the foothills, but Penny handled it well, her strength and stamina improving with each mile. They stopped frequently to let her rest and graze, and Abigail worked with her during the breaks, reinforcing the training she'd been doing at the farm. "She's ready," Abigail announced that evening as they made camp. "Whatever Thornton throws at her, she can handle it. She's sound, she's intelligent, and she moves like the quality horse she is." "You did that," Jacob said, watching Abigail brush Penny's gleaming coat. "You saw past what everyone else saw and brought out her true self. We both did. You gave her a chance when no one else would. I just helped her remember who she was meant to be." The third day dawned cold and wet, with rain that fell in sheets and turned the trail to mud. They slogged through it, miserable and soaked, but neither complained. There was too much riding on this journey to let a little weather stop them. By afternoon, the rain had turned to sleet, and visibility was so poor they almost missed the abandoned line shack that sat off the trail. It was a tiny one-room structure, barely standing, but it had a roof and walls, and that was enough. "We should stop," Jacob said, eyeing the darkening sky. "It's not safe to travel in this weather, and we're all half frozen." They took shelter, securing Penny in a lean-to attached to the shack and building a small fire in the stone hearth. The structure was barely big enough for the two of them, with gaps in the walls that let in the wind and rain, but it was infinitely better than being outside. "We should have waited for better weather," Jacob said, watching Abigail shiver violently. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her small frame, and her lips had taken on a blue tinge that scared him. "We don't have time to wait. The bank—" Her teeth chattered so hard she couldn't finish the sentence. "Damn the bank!" Jacob moved to her, concern overriding all other considerations. "You're freezing half to death. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death of cold." She nodded but didn't move, and Jacob realized she was shaking too hard to manage the buttons on her dress. The knowledge that she needed help, combined with the very real danger she was in from exposure, overrode any concerns about propriety. "Let me," he said gently, his fingers fumbling with the small buttons. "I'll keep my eyes closed if you want, but you need to get warm." "I trust you," she said simply, and those 3 words hit Jacob harder than any declaration of love could have. He worked the buttons free with as much clinical detachment as he could manage, which was difficult when every brush of his fingers against her cold skin sent fire through his veins despite the chill in the air. When the dress finally fell away, revealing her thin chemise underneath, he quickly wrapped his own coat around her shoulders and turned away to give her privacy while she removed the rest of her wet things. "There's only one blanket," Jacob said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You should take it. Don't be foolish. We'll share it. For warmth, For survival. It's practical, Jacob, nothing more. But it felt like more when they huddled together under the threadbare blanket, her nearly naked body pressed against his fully clothed one, his arms wrapped around her to share what heat he had. It felt like everything when she sighed and relaxed against him, when her violent shivers gradually subsided and she grew warm and pliant in his embrace. Jacob, her voice was quiet, thoughtful. Do you think about her, about Sarah, when you're with me like this? The question surprised him, made him think carefully before answering. I think about what I had with her, the life we built and the future we planned. I think about the fact that she'd want me to be happy, want me to live, instead of just existing. And I think, he paused, choosing his words carefully, I think that loving you doesn't mean I loved her any less. It just means my heart is big enough to hold both, to honor what was while embracing what is. Abigail turned in his arms, and suddenly they were face to face, her brown eyes searching his in the dim firelight. I'm not trying to compete with a memory, Jacob. I know I can never be her, can never fill the exact space she occupied in your life. I don't want you to be her, Jacob said firmly. Abigail, you're your own person, with your own strengths and your own way of being in the world. You make me feel things Sarah never did. Not better or worse, just different. With you, I feel like I'm building something new instead of trying to recreate something lost, and that's exactly what I need. She kissed him then, soft and slow and sweet, and Jacob felt something shift in his chest, like a door that had been locked finally swinging open. They kissed for a long time, hands exploring cautiously over clothes, hearts beating in rhythm, the cold and wet world outside forgotten in the warmth they created together. Jacob, Abigail whispered against his lips, that is, if you're ready, I'd like, say it, he urged, needing to hear the words. I want you to make me your wife, truly your wife. I don't want to wait anymore. Don't want to spend one more night apart when we could be together. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest. Are you sure? Abigail, we're in a broken-down line shack in the middle of nowhere, cold and wet and alive, she interrupted. And in love, and choosing each other despite everything telling us this is crazy. Jacob, I don't need a fancy bed or perfect circumstances. I just need you, he groaned, the sound somewhere between pain and pleasure. You undo me, Abigail Winters. Then let yourself be undone. Let us be undone together. And so, in a tiny line shack, while rain lashed the walls and wind howled through the gaps, Jacob and Abigail Miller consummated their marriage. They came together with tenderness and passion, with laughter at awkward moments and sighs of pleasure when everything aligned just right. They learned each other's bodies slowly, reverently, creating new memories that belonged only to them. Afterwards, as they lay tangled together under the blanket with the fire burning low, Abigail traced patterns on Jacob's chest. No regrets? He asked softly. None. You? Only that I waited this long. He kissed the top of her head. You're my wife now, Abigail, in every way that matters, and when we get back home, we'll do it properly, with a preacher and witnesses and whatever else you want. I don't need any of that. I have everything I need right here. They slept wrapped in each other's arms, and when morning came, they continued their journey as a truly married couple, bound together by more than desperation or practicality, bound by love and trust and the kind of intimacy that comes from choosing each other despite every reason not to. The final day of travel brought them to Helena just before noon. The town sprawled across the valley like a promise, bigger and more prosperous than Whitefish, with wide streets and substantial buildings that spoke of gold rush wealth and cattle money. Jacob felt his stomach tighten with anxiety as they led Penny through the streets, drawing curious looks from townsfolk who probably wondered what business a shabby couple and a single horse had in their thriving community. Richard Thornton's ranch sat on the outskirts of town, a sprawling operation that made Jacob's modest farm look like a child's toy. White-painted fences stretched as far as the eye could see, enclosing paddocks where sleek horses grazed on lush spring grass. The main house was a genuine mansion, 2 stories of painted wood with a wraparound porch and windows that gleamed in the sunlight. Jacob's heart sank. This was a man who dealt in quality, in the kind of horses that sold for hundreds of dollars, What would he want with a mare that had cost $3 at a backwater auction? Don't, Abigail said quietly, reading his expression. Don't talk yourself out of this before we even try. Penny's quality speaks for itself. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, tall and silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to wealth and authority. He wore fine clothes and polished boots, and his eyes were sharp as they swept over the visitors, their worn clothes, their obvious poverty, the mare between them. "Can I help you folks?" His tone suggested they'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. "Mr. Thornton?" Abigail stepped forward, and Jacob admired the way she lifted her chin with pride despite their circumstances. "My name is Abigail Miller, and this is my husband, Jacob. We've brought you a horse we think you'll want to see." Thornton's gaze swept over Penny, and something flickered in his expression. So brief, Jacob almost missed it. Then the man was circling the mare slowly, examining her from every angle, running his hands down her legs with the practiced touch of someone who knew exactly what to look for. He checked her teeth, her eyes, her conformation, taking his time, while Jacob's heart pounded so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. Finally, Thornton straightened, fixing them with that sharp gaze. "Where did you get this horse?" "A livestock auction in Whitefish," Jacob admitted, deciding honesty was the only path forward. "She was in rough shape, barely able to stand. My wife nursed her back to health over the past few weeks." "Rough shape?" Thornton laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, this mare is Blackwood's Penny Whistle, out of Blackwood's Penny Royal by Thornton's Highland Lad. Her dam was one of the finest Morgan mares in Vermont before I sold her to Harrison Blackwood 5 years ago. Penny Whistle here disappeared 2 years back, stolen from Blackwood's ranch in Wyoming. The thief must have run her hard and sold her off when she broke down." Jacob felt the ground shift under his feet. A stolen horse. They'd brought a stolen horse to the man whose bloodlines she carried. "We didn't know," Abigail said quickly. "We bought her legally at auction. We have the bill of sale." "Peace, Mrs. Miller." Thornton held up a hand. "I'm not accusing you of theft. You clearly didn't know her history, and from the sound of it, you saved her life. The question now is what we're going to do about the situation." "What do you mean?" Jacob asked warily. "I mean that Blackwood would have every right to demand this mare's return, given that she was stolen from him. But I also know Harrison, and he wrote her off 2 years ago when she went missing, filed her as a loss. I doubt he'd pursue the matter now, especially given her condition when you found her." Thornton paused, studying them both. "However, I have an interest in this bloodline. Penny Whistle's dam has produced exceptional foals, and if this mare is healthy enough to breed, her offspring would be valuable additions to my program." "Are you saying you want to buy her?" Hope flared in Jacob's chest. "I'm saying I want to make you an offer. First, though, I need to see her move properly, see if the damage from her ordeal is reversible or if she's permanently compromised." They spent the next hour putting Penny through her paces in Thornton's paddock, while the man watched with those sharp, assessing eyes. The mare performed beautifully, moving with the grace and power that Abigail had promised, showing no sign of permanent injury. Jacob could see Thornton's expression shifting from skeptical interest to genuine enthusiasm. "All right," Thornton said finally. "Here's my offer. I'll give you $150 for the mare, cash money, right now. Additionally, I'll provide you with a letter to Harrison Blackwood explaining the situation and absolving you of any claims of theft in case he ever comes looking." And he paused, clearly calculating. "I'll throw in breeding rights. You bring me a quality mare or stallion in the future, I'll breed them to my stock at a reduced rate. Call it an investment in potential partners." Jacob and Abigail exchanged glances. $150. It was more than they dared hope for, more than enough to pay the bank and have money left over for supplies and seed and starting to rebuild. "We accept," Abigail said firmly, and Jacob nodded his agreement. Thornton smiled for the first time, transforming his stern face into something almost warm. "Smart decision. Now let's get the paperwork done and I'll get you your money. And Mrs. Miller," he turned to Abigail, "you have an exceptional eye for horses. If you're ever interested in working in breeding operations, I'd be happy to have someone with your skills." "Thank you, sir, but I've got my own operation to build." She smiled, taking Jacob's hand. "We both do." An hour later, they left Thornton's ranch with a bank draft for $150, official papers declaring them the legal owners of the mare they'd sold, and a letter that would protect them from any future claims. Jacob felt like he was walking on air. "We did it," he said, hardly daring to believe it. "Abigail, we actually did it." "We did." She grinned up at him. "Now let's go home and save our farm." The ride back to Whitefish took 3 days, same as the journey out, but it felt entirely different. They traveled as husband and wife, as partners who'd gambled everything on a broken horse and a desperate plan, and somehow come out winning. They talked about their plans for the farm, about crops they'd plant and horses they'd raise, and the life they'd build together. On the final evening before reaching home, they made camp by the same creek where they'd spent their first night together. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jacob pulled Abigail close. "You know what I realized?" he said. "What?" "A month ago I was ready to give up, ready to let the bank take the farm and just walk away from everything. I had $3 to my name and no reason to keep fighting. And then I spent those $3 on a broken horse and everything changed." "Because of Penny?" "Because of what Penny represented. Hope, the possibility that broken things could be fixed, that value existed even in what everyone else had thrown away, that taking a risk on something worthless might turn out to be the smartest thing I ever did." He kissed her forehead. "And then you showed up, this woman worth 14 cents who turned out to be worth more than all the gold in Montana. You saved me, Abigail. Saved my farm, saved my future, saved my soul." "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "That's what people do when they love each other, when they choose each other, despite everything that says they shouldn't. They save each other and build something beautiful from the broken pieces." They reached the Miller farm the next afternoon, and Jacob's breath caught at the sight of it. Tom Bradley had kept his word, checking on things while they were gone, and somehow the place looked different now. Not failed or failing, but full of potential. A place where 2 people could build a future worth having. The first thing they did was ride straight to Whitefish and pay Frank Morrison at the bank. Jacob took deep satisfaction in watching the banker's jaw drop as he counted out $240 in cash, clearing the debt completely. "Where did you get this?" Morrison demanded, clearly torn between relief at being paid and suspicion about the sudden windfall. "Sold a horse," Jacob said simply, keeping his voice level. "Now, if you'll give me a receipt showing the debt's paid in full, we'll be on our way." Morrison did grudgingly, and Jacob and Abigail walked out of that bank, with their heads high and a freedom they hadn't felt in years. The farm was theirs, truly theirs, with no bank breathing down their necks and no foreclosure hanging over their heads. They stopped at the general store next, where Jacob bought flour, sugar, coffee, seed for planting, and on impulse, a bolt of beautiful blue fabric that matched Abigail's eyes. "What's this for?" she asked, running, her fingers over the cloth with obvious longing. "A new dress. You deserve something pretty, something that's just for you, and not because you need it for work. Jacob, we should be practical. We've been practical. We've been careful and cautious and scared for so long. Let me buy my wife a new dress, please." Her eyes filled with tears, and she kissed him right there in the middle of the store, not caring who saw or what they thought. "All right, but only if you let me make you a new shirt. That one's so worn I can see through it in places." "Deal!" That summer, the Miller farm came back to life like a garden after rain. Jacob planted crops that grew tall and strong in the rich valley soil. Abigail's vegetable garden produced more than they could eat, so she sold the extra at market, bringing in additional income. They bought chickens with their remaining money, then a pig, then another milk cow to keep Bessie company. But more than the physical improvements, the farm came back to life, because it had life in it again. Laughter echoed from the house. The smell of baking bread drifted from the kitchen. The sound of Abigail singing while she worked in the garden made the whole valley feel less lonely. Jacob worked from dawn to dusk, but it felt different now. He wasn't working out of desperation or obligation, but out of hope and purpose and the desire to build something lasting for the woman he loved. Every fence he mended, every field he planted, every improvement he made was an investment in their future together. In early autumn, a man from Helena rode up to their door. He was Richard Thornton's foreman, and he brought an offer that made Jacob's jaw drop. "Mr. Thornton wants to establish you as one of his satellite breeding operations," the foreman explained. "He's so pleased with how Pennywhistle is doing that he wants to set you up to raise Morgan horses for him. He'll provide you with breeding stock at reduced rates, you'll raise the foals, and he'll buy them at fair market value when they're ready. It's a partnership that could be very profitable for both parties. Jacob and Abigail exchanged glances, hardly daring to believe their good fortune. "We accept," Abigail said, and Jacob nodded his agreement. Over the next 5 years, the Miller farm transformed into one of the most successful breeding operations in western Montana. Jacob and Abigail raised Morgan horses that were prized throughout the territory for their intelligence, beauty, and versatility. They expanded the house, rebuilt the barn with a proper roof and solid walls, bought more land when it became available. But more importantly, they built a life together, a real life full of love and laughter and the comfortable intimacy of two people who'd chosen each other despite every reason not to. One spring morning, 6 years after Abigail had first appeared at his barn, Jacob stood in the paddock, watching his wife work with a yearling colt. She'd taught him everything she knew about horses over the years, and he'd become a skilled breeder in his own right. But he still loved watching her work, loved the quiet confidence she brought to every task, the gentle firmness that earned respect from even the most spirited horses. "Papa! Papa!" a small voice called, and Jacob turned to see his daughter running toward him, her dark braids flying behind her. Sarah, named for his first wife with Abigail's blessing and encouragement, was 4 years old and the light of their lives. "What is it, sweet pea?" "Mama says Penny's new foal is coming. The very last one!" Jacob's heart leaped. Penny was 14 now, past her prime breeding years, but Thornton had agreed to let them keep her final foal as a gift, a reward for years of successful partnership. This would be the last foal from the Mare who'd changed their lives. "Go tell your brother," Jacob said, sending Sarah off. Their son, Jacob Jr., was 2 years old and already showing signs of his father's love for the land and his mother's way with animals. In the barn, Abigail was already with Penny, murmuring encouragement in that low, gentle voice she used with frightened or laboring horses. Jacob moved to kneel beside his wife, his hand finding hers automatically, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "How is she?" "She's doing fine. It won't be long now." Abigail leaned against his shoulder, and Jacob wrapped his arm around her, struck by how perfectly she still fit against him after all these years. 2 hours later, a perfect filly lay in the clean straw, all long legs and soft brown eyes, and the promise of the same quality that had made her mother so valuable. Penny nickered softly to her baby, cleaning her with long strokes of her tongue, and Jacob felt tears prick his eyes. "Remember when you bought her for $3? Abigail murmured, her own voice thick with emotion. "Best $3 I ever spent." "Well, second best. What was first?" "The train ticket I sent you, even though I don't remember doing it. That brought me you, and you're worth more than all the horses and land in the world." Abigail turned in his arms, kissing him softly. "We did good, didn't we? Took our broken pieces and built something beautiful. We did better than good. We made a miracle out of $3.14. They sat together in the quiet barn, watching Penny and her new filly, and Jacob thought about how far they'd come, from desperation and despair to this moment of pure contentment, from broken people leading a broken horse to a family and a thriving farm and a future full of promise. Outside the barn, spring sunshine warmed the Montana Valley. The fields were green and thriving, dotted with grazing horses that bore the Miller name and carried the bloodlines that had started with one desperate purchase at a backwater auction. The farmhouse rang with children's laughter. Smoke curled from the chimney, and everything spoke of life and prosperity and hope fulfilled. "You know what I think?" Abigail said, her head resting on Jacob's shoulder as they watched the new foal try her legs for the first time. "What's that?" "I think sometimes the most worthless things turn out to be priceless. Sometimes all you need is someone willing to see the value underneath the damage, and sometimes broken people and broken horses can heal each other and build something beautiful from the wreckage." "Wise woman," Jacob said, kissing the top of her head. "I learned from the best, from a man who saw a dying horse and bought her with his last $3 because he couldn't bear to see a creature suffer. From a man who looked at a mail-order bride with 14 cents and saw a partner instead of a burden. From a man who taught me that hope is always worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible. Jacob pulled her closer, this small, fierce woman who'd saved his life in every way that mattered, and silently thanked whatever force had brought her to his door that day. Sarah would have liked her, he thought. Sarah would have understood that loving again didn't diminish what they'd had, but honored it by proving that Jacob's heart was big enough to love deeply more than once. As they sat there surrounded by the evidence of their success, the healthy horses, the thriving farm, their beautiful children playing in the sunshine, Jacob Miller knew one thing for certain. He'd spent $3 on a dying horse and gained everything that mattered. A partner who believed in him, a family that filled his heart to bursting, a life worth living instead of just enduring, a future bright with promise and possibility. And it all started with a mare named Penny, who proved that hope could be found in the most unexpected places, that value existed even in what others discarded, that second chances were real if you were brave enough to reach for them. Sometimes all it took was $3 and the willingness to see what others missed. Sometimes that was enough to change everything.